There is a county in eastern Ohio where the auditor's office keeps a shelf of leather-bound road books going back to 1820. Thick books handwritten in iron gall ink recording every road in the county with the name of the farmer who owned each adjacent parcel, the width of the right-of-way, the date it was opened, and the names of the township trustees who authorized it. Hundreds of roads, thousands of entries. The last entry in one of those books is dated 1871, not because the county ran out of roads, because someone stopped writing them down. I found that shelf while trying to trace why a particular farm lane in Guernsey County appeared on an 1854 plat map and simply wasn't there by 1895. Not moved, not rerouted, gone without explanation. The road had been formally vacated, a legal term meaning a township votes to abandon a public road and return it to the adjacent landowner. What I didn't expect was how many times I'd find that same word in those books. Vacated, vacated, vacated. Whole corridors of connected road disappearing from the public record in the 1870s and 1880s, not from neglect, but from formal legal action. Someone was asking for those roads to be closed. Let me explain what those roads actually were, because the word road in 1850 means something completely different than it does today. By 1840, the United States had built approximately 10,000 miles of improved turnpike roads across New England and the mid-Atlantic states. These were privately financed toll roads, yes, but they connected to something larger, a network, a system of post roads established by federal law that created continuous routes from Maine to Georgia, from the Atlantic coast to the Ohio River. The National Road, funded by Congress in 1806 and completed through to Vandalia, Illinois by 1837, was the spine of that system, 60 feet wide in places. Macadamized stone surface, bridges engineered to carry loaded freight wagons, free to use. The Land Ordinance of 1785 had already mandated a township road grid across the Northwest Territory, carving the future states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin into sections with public road corridors established by law before a single settler arrived. The government built the road network into the ownership structure of the land itself. By 1850, that network was functional. A farmer in central Indiana could load his wagon with grain, connect to a post road, and move goods across state lines without paying freight to any corporation. He paid his road tax in labor 3 to 6 days per year, maintaining the section of road adjacent to his land. That was the arrangement. Public roads maintained by the public, free to use, connecting every county seat to every neighboring county seat in a continuous web. Then came the railroads. Between 1850 and 1870, railroad mileage in the United States went from roughly 9,000 miles to 53,000 miles. By 1890, it had reached 163,000. The numbers are in every history textbook. What the textbooks don't explain is what happened to the roads during that same period. Not what was built, what was taken away. It wasn't gradual erosion. It wasn't simply that roads fell into disuse as rail travel became more convenient. The legal record tells a more specific story. Township trustees across the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic states received formal petitions in the 1870s and 1880s asking them to vacate public roads. The petitioners were often named farmers adjacent to the road who wanted the right-of-way back. But read deeper into those petition files, the ones that still exist in county archives, and you find something else. The railroad companies needed farm roads to fail. A farmer who could haul his own grain to a river port or a neighboring county's mill was a farmer who didn't need to pay railroad freight rates. The collapse of the road network wasn't a side effect of railroad expansion. It was a precondition for railroad monopoly. The patrons of husbandry, known as the Grange, understood this in real time. Founded in 1867, the Grange grew to 850,000 members by 1875, primarily Midwestern farmers who were watching their freedom of movement being systematically purchased out from under them. Their newspaper accounts from the 1870s describe something that should be in every American history class, and isn't. They describe the specific mechanism by which railroad companies lobbied township trustees to vacate road corridors that ran parallel to rail lines. One Illinois Grange circular from 1873 put it plainly: the railroad desired a monopoly, and a monopoly required the elimination of every alternative. If there's no road, there's no alternative. If there's no alternative, the railroad sets the price and the farmer pays it, or his crop rots. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 was Congress's first attempt to regulate railroad pricing. It came 20 years after the process was already largely complete. The roads were already gone by the time the government acknowledged the problem. In New York State alone, the plank road mania of the 1840s and 1850s had produced more than 3,500 miles of improved plank roads connecting interior farm country to river ports and market towns. By 1880, fewer than 500 miles remained in functional condition. The official explanation is that wooden plank roads deteriorated quickly and were expensive to maintain. That's true as far as it goes. What it doesn't explain is why so many were never replaced, never upgraded, never converted to macadam or gravel, simply allowed to rot into the ground while the railroad ran a parallel line 3 miles to the east, and charged rates that the New York Farmers Alliance calculated took between 30 and 60% of a farmer's gross margin on grain shipments. The Ohio Good Roads Association was founded in 1887, not to build new roads, to rebuild roads that had already existed and been allowed to fail. Their founding documents are explicit about this. They were trying to recover something that had been lost, not pioneer something new. Ohio had documented over 88,000 miles of country roads in 1850. The association's 1888 report estimated that fewer than a third were in condition to support loaded freight wagons. In 1890, the federal government conducted its most comprehensive census of American infrastructure to that point. It documented railroad mileage, canal mileage, and urban street paving in meticulous detail. It did not systematically count rural road mileage. There was no federal category for local farm roads in the 1890 census. The roads that had defined American rural life for 70 years simply didn't register as infrastructure worth counting. That's around the time I start looking for the farmers. There had to have been men in every township in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan in the 1890s who were in their 70s and 80s. Men who had been born in the 1810s and 1820s and had spent their working lives driving wagons on roads that no longer existed. Men who could tell their grandchildren exactly which roads had been there when they'd been vacated, who'd petitioned to close them, and what the township trustees had said at the meeting. The Federal Writers Project, Roosevelt's New Deal program that sent journalists and researchers to record the life histories of ordinary Americans, interviewed 2,900 people across 24 states between 1936 and 1940. The project description says the interviews captured pioneer journeys, surviving hardship, and the texture of rural life. What it doesn't highlight is how many of those interviewees were farmers in their 90s, born before the Civil War, born before the railroads, born into the world where the road network was still intact and belonged to everyone who needed to travel it. The interviews are in the Library of Congress. They've been publicly available since the 1970s. Most of them have never been read carefully for this. I went looking in those transcripts for one specific thing. Any description of a road that the interviewee knew had been there and wasn't anymore. Any mention of a route that their father or grandfather had used that had been closed in their lifetime. The project's indexing system doesn't make this easy to search, but it's there. Fragments in the margins of other stories. An old man in Indiana describing how he used to drive to market by a road through his neighbor's timber lot that they shut down when the railroad came through. A woman in Illinois mentioning that her father had fought at a township meeting in 1874 to keep a road open that the neighbors wanted vacated after the Chicago and Northwestern put a depot 2 miles east. The stories exist. They're incomplete, inconsistent, embedded in accounts about other things. Because the government writers weren't sent to document the road network. They were sent to document lives. And by 1936, the people who remembered the old road network were in their 80s and 90s, describing a world that their interviewers had no framework to understand or contextualize. The Good Roads movement, which formally launched in 1892 with the founding of the League of American Wheelmen, reframed the entire history in the process of addressing it. Their literature described American roads as having always been poor, primitive, neglected since the founding. A problem to be solved by modern engineering and federal investment. What it didn't describe was the functional network that had existed before railroad expansion and been systematically dismantled between 1860 and 1890. The movement's founding myth required American roads to have always been bad. The alternative, acknowledging that good roads had existed and been legally vacated at the behest of railroad interests, would have raised questions the railroad-friendly Congress of the 1890s wasn't prepared to answer. By the time the federal government began the Good Roads Survey in 1893, the farmers who had driven those pre-railroad roads were dying. Their children had grown up in a world where the railroad was simply how things moved, where paying freight rates was as natural as paying for seed. Their grandchildren would fight in the First World War and come home to a country building automobile highways and calling it progress, with no memory that there had ever been anything to lose. There were county road books that could have told the complete story, plat maps, petition files, township trustee minutes recording every road vacation vote. Some of those records survive in county courthouses and historical society basements in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Michigan. Many don't. County records from the 1870s and 1880s were routinely destroyed in the courthouse fires that are scattered across Midwestern legal history with a frequency that researchers have noted, but nobody has systematically counted. Delaware County, Ohio, Shelby County, Tennessee, Jasper County, Missouri, Clark County, Indiana, Pike County, Illinois, each fire destroying the specific decade of records that would have shown who was petitioning to close which roads and who was voting yes. Each fire individually explainable. Together they form a different kind of pattern. The road books that do survive end the same way, not with a final entry marking the closure of the system, just with a last date and then silence, as if the person keeping the record simply stopped one day and no one picked up the pen again. I keep thinking about a particular kind of man, a farmer born in 1815 in central Ohio, who had spent his 20s driving grain to Zanesville on the National Road, who had watched the railroad come through in the 1850s and watched the road petitions come through in the 1870s, who had stood up at a township meeting and argued against vacating the road his father had helped build with his own hands as part of his road labour obligation, and lost the vote, and lived another 40 years watching the field grow back over the right-of-way. By 1900, he would have been 85. He would have had grandchildren who had never seen the road his father built. He would have tried to explain to them what it meant to move goods from one county to the next, without anyone taking a cut, without any corporation setting the terms, without any depot agent telling you the rate had gone up again and there wasn't a thing you could do about it. And his grandchildren would have nodded politely because the railroad was all they'd ever known, and to them it wasn't a loss. It was simply the way the world worked. He would have had a story that no government writer ever came to record. The Library of Congress has those 2,900 WPA transcriptions. The county courthouses have what's left of the road books. The 1890 census has no systematic count of what was lost. And the Good Roads movement built its origin story on the premise that there was nothing to recover. The timeline isn't subtle if you look at it whole and in sequence. The 1785 Land Ordinance builds the road grid into the land itself. The National Road opens commerce free of corporate toll by 1837. By 1850, the network connects 30 states and 23 million people who rely on it. Between 1860 and 1880, railroad mileage grows sixfold while road vacation petitions accumulate in courthouse filing cabinets across the Midwest. The Grange rises, documents the mechanism, peaks at 850,000 members, and is politically neutralized by 1880. The courthouse fires cluster in the 1870s and 1880s. The road books go silent. The 1890 census counts no rural roads. The Good Roads movement launches in 1892 on the premise that American roads were always bad. The WPA scrambles to interview the last witnesses between 1936 and 1939. It's defunded before finishing. By 1950, the farmers who drove the old roads are gone. The plat maps remember even when the road books don't. The Grange newspapers remember even when the congressional record doesn't. The old farmers in those WPA transcripts remember even when the indexers who catalogued the interviews didn't know to flag what they were saying. And somewhere in those 2,900 WPA transcriptions, in the accounts of farmers who kept mentioning roads they used to travel that don't appear on any current map, the specific geography of what was lost is still sitting in the archive, waiting for someone to compare it against the railroad expansion maps, waiting for someone to lay the road vacation petitions next to the railroad incorporation dates and see whether the pattern holds county by county, state by state, decade by decade. Waiting for someone willing to ask not just where the roads went, but who benefited from their going, because the last farmer who remembered the old roads is gone. But the roads themselves left outlines in the soil that aerial photography now reveals as crop marks and shadow lines, in ploughed fields across Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. Soil disturbed by decades of gravel and packed earth compacts differently than undisturbed ground, the roads are still visible to anyone looking from high enough. The question is whether anyone is looking and whether the county that stopped writing in its road book in 1871 still has that book on a shelf in the auditor's office. It does, and the last entry is still there, and the road it records is still a faint line in a field outside Guernsey County if you know where to look and what you're looking for. The question is whether anyone is looking.